Yo ho ho mateys and welcome. If you are new here, my name's Carrie. If you aren't new here, then welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about one of the kind of biggest reoccurring arguments in the book space online. And I feel I don't know how to explain this. I've tried to make this video a few times now, and every time I research more into it and I get sadder and more angry, and I have a lot of feelings about this. So we're going to be talking about book piracy, especially about the recent developments with oceanofpdf, which is one of the biggest, in fact, is the biggest piracy site. And what it means for publishing, what it means for people who are readers, people who are creators, etc., and the publishing industry itself. So there's a lot to cover, and I also want to talk about morality and ethics and the consequences of using or not using these sites. But we're going to start with a disclaimer. Before we get into it, I would like to just do a little disclaimer, because I am speaking from a British perspective where we are very, very lucky in the UK to not have books taxed. They cannot be taxed legally, so in the UK books can often be cheaper than elsewhere in the world. We also have a lot more access to books. There are a lot of libraries in the UK. Pretty much every town has one or more. We have online library apps, etc. There are a lot of ways to legally and freely download books, etc. However, saying all of that, I grew up very, very poor. I grew up in a family that was on the poverty line, if not below it, and often literally couldn't afford food. So there was a time where I was a voracious reader as a kid. Like, my mum, who was disabled, would have to take me to the library often to get books. I also really wanted a book when I was younger that I wasn't able to have for ages. So when I was young, I wanted this book, Atticus the Storyteller's 100 Greek Myths. And for a very long time, I was not able to get it because we couldn't afford it. Now, this book is $12.99, it says on the back. And when I was younger, my babysitter worked in a bookshop. So sometimes when we went in to visit her, I would read a page at a time until eventually my mum was able to save up enough to buy it for me. So I have experienced both worlds in the UK itself on both sides of this dilemma. However, now I live in a different country. I live in Armenia. I don't currently have a job. I live in a country where the main language is not English. The second language isn't even English, it's the third. And they have very little access to English books, especially new releases. And when I look at the libraries here, they don't have much in the way of English speaking books. So I feel pretty well placed to speak from both sides, to be honest. So this has become a massive issue in the book community. At the start of July, this website was shut down, oceanofpdf, and the internet went a bit crazy. So I think there was a lot of discourse online, and it mainly came down to people opposing the site and being glad that it was gone, although it is back up now, because they want authors to be fairly paid for their work. They don't want this piracy to exist. And then the other side was focusing on how there are circumstances under which it can be deemed morally acceptable to pirate. So I think one thing I have to point out here is there are a lot of reasons as to why people may want to pirate books and may feel morally justified in doing so. You know, it would be ignorant for us to say that there are no circumstances under which people pirate or should pirate, but you know, we have people all around the world who cannot access books because there are no libraries in their country, because they literally cannot afford it, because they're disabled and they cannot get to these places. However, something I do want to note here is that when we were having this conversation online at the time, a lot of it felt quite disingenuous, and I don't say that lightly. I know that people are genuinely wanting to make that point, especially if they are of those circumstances. However, a lot of the time, at least from the comments I was reading, it seemed like people were using it as more of a gotcha moment to kind of counteract people who were making valid points about piracy and the effects it has on authors. It was almost as if people were being performative with it. Like, oh, here's this issue. Well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? What about this person? And for me, some of it felt as though it's a straw man argument. And a straw man argument, if you're not familiar, is to essentially say that, oh, here's this scenario you've not thought of. Here's this scenario, this is what's really happening, blah, 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 and kind of derail you from the original point. And I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. It does. There are people with these circumstances. However, a lot of the conversations around it felt very disingenuous, and I do think that's a problem. If we look at the reasons why people do pirate, we can understand it, right? When I was at university, I had a lecturer literally tell us a website to download textbooks because there weren't enough in the library. So we have academics trying to get textbooks, especially rare textbooks. When I was writing my dissertation, it was really hard to find some texts that I kind of wanted to reference or research more from. And when I would ask my library, they couldn't necessarily locate them easily. So there are those issues to consider, and I think one of the main reasons people do actually pirate is that they can also not have access to a library. Like, there are a lot of people around the world who do not have access to libraries. I think, speaking from a UK perspective, I think it's very hard to argue that there's no access in the UK, because there is, even if it's not your local library or something of those things. I'm still signed up to my library from the UK now and can access it through Libby. When we look at affordability, I also think this is a very, very tricky one. I mentioned earlier how growing up, like, we literally could not afford food sometimes. So even buying a $12.99 book was a stretch. We couldn't do it until months later. So affordability is something I feel very strongly about, but something that is very hard to qualify. Because if I say I cannot afford something, that could mean different things, right? I don't have a job at the moment. I'm being supported by my husband. If I say I can't afford something, that doesn't mean that there won't be food on the table, you know? And I think that's something that we lose in online discussions. If two people were to say they can't afford something, it's hard to know what they mean by that, because one person could literally be like me as a child and is making a choice between this and food. The other person could be saying they can't afford something, but it's because they know they probably shouldn't be buying it, or maybe there's a holiday they're saving up for, or a mortgage they're saving up for, etc. But they can actually afford it, if that makes sense. Like, it's not going to mean they're not feeding themselves. It might just mean that maybe they don't buy an extra bar of chocolate or something along those lines. Like, I'm trying to put this situation out so that people can kind of, because that's the perspective I haven't seen added to this discussion yet, is that affordability means a lot of different things, and trying to unpick that in an online context is very hard. And then we also have disabilities, right? People who have disabilities and are unable to access a physical library or bookshop, etc., which is another issue in itself. And disabilities are vast and varied and can lead to different things, right? Some people are disabled and can't access ebooks because it's not right for them and their needs. So it's a really difficult one to look at. Now, I think there is something to be said that if people do pirate, there's almost online at the moment a kind of publicizing of it that I haven't really seen before. I have seen instances of people in authors' comment sections on Instagram or Twitter or Threads or whatever it is, saying, "Oh, I've got the PDF of this if anyone wants it," etc., which is wild. But I don't think people should publicize that they do this, and also that they should accept some of the circumstances. I think if you don't have a library near you, there is something to be said for trying to ensure that that is a reality. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be possible, but in the UK, you can reach out to your MP, ask them, why don't we have a local library, etc. I think this is something that we need to fight for libraries, especially because in the UK we're already losing so many library staff, and my local library has now become you have to tap in and tap out, and there's no staff there. So we need to demonstrate a need for them. Now, I want to move on to the second part of the discussion, which is the consequences for authors. Now, Maggie, I don't know how to say her name. Maggie Stiefvater? I'm not sure. She wrote The Raven Cycle, and she wrote a really interesting Tumblr post years ago about the consequences of piracy within her career. Now, Maggie is a huge author, right? You wouldn't say she's an independent because she's traditionally published. She's had series. They are very well-renowned series. She's a big YA author. And she directly experienced the consequences of piracy in her series. So I won't read out all of the information, but essentially, and I'll leave it in the link below if you haven't read the post, but she, in her series was going really well, hitting the New York Times bestseller list for several books. And then the third is when e-arcs were introduced. And what she found happened was the second e-arcs were introduced, they ended up on these piracy sites, and sales for the following book went down drastically. And people were saying, why is this happening? Blah, blah, blah. Maybe people just don't like ebooks anymore. And she decided that for the next book that she released, which they also cut the amount of copies to sell because they were worried that people just didn't like the series anymore, therefore cutting her earnings as an author, she decided enough was enough, and she flooded the market online with like phony PDFs. And it actually led to an increase in sales because people couldn't find the actual PDF of her book online. So they went and bought it instead. So we can see through that, obviously it is only one example, but that there are consequences to this piracy. That had a negative impact on her career and her earnings as an author, which is really interesting. And then I've also seen other scenarios online where at the moment independent authors are being blacklisted from Amazon because of their books ending up on piracy sites. Because Amazon for independent authors has clauses in their contract that say you can't essentially publicize the work at any competing kind of things. And because of their terms of service and, you know, all being automated, is that the right word? But it all being like automatic, is they are getting striked because of the books ending up on piracy sites, and it's really hard for them to overcome that. So independent authors are also losing money. The other thing to consider is that the current, this was from 3 years ago, this article I found, that research has shown that the income of professional authors averages only £7,000 in the UK, making the profession inaccessible and unsustainable to most. So this is a real problem. People cannot afford to be authors anymore. It's something really hard to do, especially with the impact of piracy. Now, I don't think the article links piracy to that figure, but I just thought it was something really intriguing to mention here. And really important. When I was researching this, I also found out a few other interesting things, because in the discussions that I've seen online, people have claimed that authors don't get paid for having their books in the library. And in the UK, at least, I can only speak from that perspective, they do. So authors get paid for library holds in the UK. It's part of our library scheme or something, but it's part of the law. They get paid for that. They also get paid for the book to go into the library in the first place, whether that's physically like an ebook or an audiobook. So they do get paid, which is really interesting and something I think that they should introduce more around the world if possible. Another thing I found which was really interesting, because I kept seeing everyone say that, you know, these piracy sites should exist so that people from other countries or the global south, or I don't love the term, but third world countries, should have access to books, which I entirely agree, they should have access to books. However, I looked into this because I was really intrigued to see the demographics of people who actually use oceanofpdf. So I looked for the stats from June, and it said that, so in June 2026, and I will leave this link down below from where I found this, and I don't know how trustworthy the website is, so I must admit that. In June 2026, there were 23.69 million visits to the website. And if you look at the website traffic by country, the United States made up for 28% of that. So they were by far where people accessed it from the most. The next country is India with 11%, then the United Kingdom with 4.89%, then Australia, and then Canada. So out of the top 5 countries that accessed this website, only one does not have English as their main language. I know Canada also has French as their main language, but the point I'm making is that that's why it felt that, to me, some of the discussion surrounding this was so disingenuous, because by far the majority of people accessing this website are from very capitalist societies that should theoretically have access to books very easily and accessible in many, many different ways. Like, we know that the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada have access to many, many libraries. In India, that may be a little different. And obviously, those countries are also quite varied and big and may not have libraries local to them, but there are other schemes available. So I thought it was really important to point that out. And something I just found incredibly interesting, because there are alternatives. So this was also something I saw people mentioning a lot. There are a lot of alternatives. Obviously, the library being the main alternative to physically buying these copies or ebooks, but also like setting up networks with your friends where you borrow and lend books between you, or audio and ebooks also sometimes being available with subscriptions you might have anyway, like Spotify. And people arguing that people should become a reviewer to access free ARCs, which I do think is potentially a good way to do it. There aren't, as far as I know, any restrictions on where you can set up a NetGalley account from. And like me, I have just restarted my NetGalley account, and like, I'm getting rejected for all the books I want, but I'm trying to go for books that I might not have otherwise read, and the read now titles, so that I can get my score up, so that I'm eligible for the books I want. So there are options. I think another thing that's really important to talk about is entitlement. So I think everyone fundamentally is entitled to read and to experience art. However, I don't think that this necessarily means that people are entitled to read every single book that they want, because I saw a tweet where someone compared it to food, right? So everyone has the right to food, to eat, to have life-sustaining, like, nurture. That doesn't mean that I can just go into a shop or a restaurant and have something just because I have the right to eat, if that makes sense. Now, I feel like it's a bit hyperbolic and everything, but I don't think that it's... I think we have become very aware of a lot of different books, and the online kind of consumerism culture leads us to want more. You know, if you look at my bookshelves, I have a lot of books. I bought them from the UK with me here because I knew that I wouldn't get the chance to read them otherwise. And still, I want more books. And some of these books I look at, and at the time I was desperate to have them. And yet a year or so later, they're still on my shelf and I haven't read them yet. And I think the same is true for people who pirate books. Obviously not everyone, but how many people do download a book and then it sits in their Kindle gallery for years unread? So why not just buy the book? So I think it's really difficult. The other side of this entitlement argument is that authors are entitled to be paid for their labour, for their work, because, like I said, the median income for an author in the UK is £7,000. Fundamentally, by pirating books, even for like independent or like megastar authors like the Sarah J. Maasters of the world, they are losing money. They are losing the ability to publish more. If you are a newer author and your book is pirated a lot, then publishing houses are less likely to take you on. So we are also negatively impacting people's careers, which is a problem. Now, I think one of the issues when we look at this is the morality. And I think, having been a philosophy teacher, this is the thing I find the most interesting about it. So when we look at the morality of everything, I think there are three main branches that are going to be at play here, which are: do you see the act itself as wrong? So do you see the act of theft as wrong? Do you see the consequences of that act as what is wrong or right? Or do you see the situation as depending? Because if you see the act itself as wrong, if you see the theft as wrong, then no one should pirate books. No one should read the pirated books. These sites should be shut down. If that's the deontological Kantian perspective. If you see the consequences as what's going to drive you to this decision, then that is authors not being paid for their work, or people not being able to access certain books to read. And that will also impact how you feel about this. Now, if you want to be a relativist, then it's going to depend on the situation. And I feel like this is where we kind of spiral as a community, because there's a lot of kind of, well, what about this situation? What about this situation? Which just muddies the waters. So I think when we're talking about this as a community, it's important to remember that people are going to come to this with a different perspective on what is immoral itself. Is it the act? Is it the consequences? Or is it the situation itself? And the differences there that make it moral or immoral. To me personally, I feel that it is the... I don't know. Whenever I think about this, I kind of go between the deontology and the consequences. And I think either way I come down at it being immoral. However, although I feel the theft and the consequences for authors are what make it immoral, I also think there are circumstances under which it is understandable to do it, to pirate books. But I don't think that makes it moral. We can say that it's understandable people do it, but I don't think that we can say that it is a moral thing to do, if that makes sense. So I think that's where it gets really tricky. Now, the solution? Is there one? I don't think there is. I think these websites are going to keep popping up in different forms. I know of many websites that are like this, although I didn't ever consider using them for fictional books until this argument came into being. So there are many websites, they're going to keep popping up. They get copyright struck, they go down, they come back up under a different name. I think that we're never going to be free of them. However, I think there are some things that people can do to help, is to not use them, is to engage with other forms of reading, like Archive of Our Own, where you can read fan fiction. Obviously not everyone's cup of tea, but there is also the Open Library, which is a free, legal way to download books. The problem is that it doesn't have the new releases that everyone wants. But if it's about reading, then it's about reading. It's not about reading the newest, Autumn Woods book, or whatever the book that you are wanting to read is. So I think that's where it is a little bit... I think the other solution, And I've seen a lot of people argue online to say that they should be able to pirate books because they've already bought the physical copy, is that publishers should reduce the price of ebooks, because at times it is more expensive to buy the book on Kindle than it is to buy the physical book. Now, that is for various reasons. Some lists on like the hottest books to buy don't include the sales of ebooks, so they want the list to reflect the physical books and therefore put the price of the ebook up, so you're more likely to go and buy the physical. A lot of people say that if they have already bought the physical book, they should be able to get the ebook for free. I don't know if I completely agree with this, because I think then you could raise the issue of, oh, well, I don't want to have the ebook, so can therefore my physical copy of the book be less expensive? And also, how would you qualify this? Because if I was in a bookshop, surely I could go into any book, open it and be like, there's the code, I'm going to pop that in and now it's free, etc. I do think that they need to reduce the price of ebooks. I don't know how that works, like logistically. If you get a discount, if you buy the physical book, but again, how does that work? If people can look in the book and take the code. So it's really tricky. And I think there's never going to be a solution, but I think we need to have a little bit more understanding of the perspectives where people are coming from when we talk about this. I think some people are just straight up never going to buy the book, and they're not going to care about the consequences. I think some people do care, but are in deeply uncomfortable situations in which this is their only way forward. And I think some just want to rage bait and maybe are too young to kind of understand the consequences, because that's something else. The book community has grown so much that we have a lot of younger people coming in and like being led by example. So I think there's a lot to think about when it comes to this, but I want people to try and go forward to be more, I don't know, considerate, or really think about your perspective. Where is your perspective coming from? What events in your life have led you to your take on this? Why is that? And where may other people be differing from you? Is kind of what I want us to leave off on. I'm sorry if this has been quite rambly and not making a lot of sense, but I think those are just some of my thoughts, and there will be times where I have not I was going to say eloquated, but I don't think that's a word. There will be times when I haven't been as eloquent as I would have liked to have been in this video, and I'm sure in the comments I will be like making myself clearer or clarifying things, or even in the edit maybe putting in some more clips to clarify, etc. But I just want us to give each other a little bit of grace when we come to these discussions, because I think the community can get so kind of like and attacky at each other that I don't think it's actually helpful, and I think it detracts from the main issues which do need to be addressed, like the price of ebooks or the morality and where that comes from. So yeah, I hope that that was at least interesting for you. If you liked this video, then please stick around and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to try and make more videos like this because I find them really interesting, and sometimes I feel that I have a perspective that I haven't seen mentioned a lot. So yeah, I just want to kind of leave that there. And yeah, like, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comments. What is your perspective? Where does your kind of morality on this come from? And let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.